The millionaire's daughter never walked until one poor boy did something unbelievable that made the millionaire cry. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Richard Walker's penthouse office in Manhattan, but he barely noticed. At 42, he'd built a tech empire worth over $300 million, yet felt more hollow than ever. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd revolutionized communication through artificial intelligence couldn't find the words to heal his own daughter's broken spirit. "Daddy, I had the dream again," came a soft voice from the doorway. Richard's heart clenched as he turned to see Emma, his 7-year-old daughter, wheeling herself into his office. Her bright blue eyes, so much like her late mother's, held a weight that no child should carry. The custom-made wheelchair, titanium frame, ergonomic design, worth more than most people's cars, couldn't mask the simple truth that haunted them both. Emma had never taken a single step in her life. Born with spina bifida, Emma's condition had consumed Richard's world. He'd consulted the finest specialists from Johns Hopkins to Mayo Clinic. Experimental surgeries, cutting-edge therapies, treatments that existed only in research papers. Nothing had worked. Each failed attempt left another crack in his daughter's smile, another shadow in those innocent eyes. "The same dream, sweetheart?" Richard asked, kneeling beside her chair. He'd heard this story dozens of times, but never interrupted. In Emma's dreams, she ran through Central Park, her legs strong and free, chasing butterflies with the other children. "I was running so fast, Daddy, faster than anyone." Her voice carried a bittersweet hope that made Richard's chest tighten. "Mom was there too. She was cheering for me." Richard's throat constricted. Sarah had died in a car accident when Emma was 3, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone while building his company. Guilt gnawed at him constantly. Guilt for working late nights, for the treatments that failed, for the normal childhood Emma would never have. Outside, the city hummed with life. 40 floors below, people rushed through their daily routines, their legs carrying them effortlessly from one moment to the next. Richard had offered $1 million reward to anyone who could help Emma walk, but the medical community had been clear. Some miracles were beyond their reach. That afternoon, as Emma's physical therapist packed up after another session, yielding no progress, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He was tired of sterile hospital rooms and clinical trials. Maybe what Emma needed wasn't found in any medical journal. "Emma," he said, his voice unusually determined, "tomorrow we're going somewhere different." "Where, Daddy?" "Downtown, to see how other people live." Little did Richard know that 7 blocks away, a homeless 7-year-old boy named Tommy Martinez was digging through a dumpster behind a restaurant, his small hands searching for anything edible. Tommy had been living on the streets for 2 months since his grandmother died, invisible to most passers-by. But tomorrow, their worlds would collide in the most unexpected way. The polished steel doors of Richard Walker's private elevator opened onto a world he'd spent 7 years carefully avoiding. The Mercedes had been dismissed. Today, they would navigate the city like ordinary people, though Richard's $1,000 Italian shoes and Emma's state-of-the-art wheelchair made their difference obvious to anyone paying attention. "Daddy, it smells different here," Emma observed as they emerged from the subway station at 125th Street. The air carried a mixture of frying plantains, car exhaust, and something indefinably alive that their climate-controlled penthouse had never known. "Different how, sweetheart?" Emma considered carefully, her 7-year-old mind working to articulate something profound. Like real life. Like people actually live here instead of just visiting. Richard felt a pang of recognition. For years, he'd created a sterile bubble around his daughter, private tutors who came to them, exclusive therapy sessions in pristine medical facilities, carefully curated social interactions with other wealthy families whose children spoke in whispers and played with educational toys, worth more than most families' monthly rent. They walked slowly through streets that pulsed with authentic energy. Elderly Dominican men played dominoes on folding tables, their animated Spanish commentary creating a rhythm that matched the salsa music spilling from second-story windows. Teenagers had transformed a bare concrete wall into a magnificent mural depicting community heroes. Teachers, firefighters, grandmothers, and children, their faces rendered in colors that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "Look at that, Daddy." Emma pointed to a young mother pushing her toddler on a makeshift swing constructed from rope and a wooden plank. She made a playground out of nothing. The ingenuity everywhere was remarkable. Children played elaborate games of make-believe with cardboard boxes transformed into spaceships, stickball games that turned the entire street into Yankee Stadium, and jump rope competitions that would have impressed Olympic athletes. Their joy was infectious, unfiltered by the self-consciousness that seemed to mark children from their rarefied social circle. They found themselves at Marcus Garvey Park, where families had claimed patches of grass with colorful blankets and folding chairs that had seen better days. The playground equipment was older, worn smooth by countless small hands, but it buzzed with more authentic happiness than the pristine, barely used facilities in their upscale neighborhood parks. Emma watched intently as children her age engaged in complex social negotiations, sharing toys, creating elaborate rules for games that seemed to evolve by the minute, helping smaller children reach monkey bars, and settling disputes with the kind of fairness that adults often struggled to achieve in boardrooms. "They're so good at being friends," Emma said quietly, and Richard heard something in her voice he'd never noticed before, not just observation, but longing. That's when they both noticed him. A small boy sat cross-legged by the ornate fountain, completely absorbed in arranging colorful bottle caps in intricate geometric patterns on the concrete ledge. His clothes told a story that Richard was only beginning to learn how to read. Jeans patched with fabric that didn't quite match, suggesting careful hands that valued preservation over appearance. A jacket several sizes too large that had clearly belonged to someone else first. Sneakers that had walked countless miles but were still laced with precise attention to symmetry. Despite the obvious signs of poverty, there was something almost aristocratic about the child's bearing. His concentration was complete, his movements deliberate and graceful. The mathematical precision of his bottle cap arrangements suggested a mind that found beauty in patterns others might overlook entirely. When he looked up from his work, Richard was struck by eyes that held depths of experience that seemed impossible in someone so young. The boy's gaze moved to Emma's wheelchair, without the usual sequence of emotions Richard had come to expect. No startled double-take, no awkward averting of eyes, no uncomfortable pity masquerading as kindness. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed recognition between two souls who understood what it meant to navigate the world differently. "Who do you think he is?" Emma whispered, but there was no apprehension in her voice, only fascination, and something that might have been recognition. Richard found himself walking closer, drawn by an inexplicable certainty that this moment was significant. In 3 decades of building his technology empire, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people and opportunities. And right now, every instinct told him that this encounter would alter the trajectory of their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Tommy Martinez had learned to read people the way other children read picture books, quickly, intuitively, and with an understanding that survival often depended on accurate first impressions. The man approaching in the obviously expensive suit radiated wealth in every detail, from his perfectly styled hair to his shoes, that probably cost more than Tommy had seen in cash since his grandmother's death 2 months ago. But the little girl in the wheelchair looked at him with something Tommy had almost forgotten existed. Genuine curiosity without judgment, interest without agenda, the kind of direct gaze that suggested she saw him as a person rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. "Those patterns are incredible," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Are you making mathematical art?" Tommy's hands stilled among the bottle caps. In his experience, conversations with wealthy people followed predictable scripts. Polite acknowledgement, followed by hasty retreat once they realized he had no fixed address, no guardian to call, no neat category into which their charitable impulses could fit him. But something about this girl's directness, her use of the word mathematical, suggested she might actually understand what he was trying to create. "My grandmother called it finding the hidden music in everyday things," he said quietly, his voice carrying the careful articulation she'd taught him, the proper grammar she'd insisted would serve him well regardless of his circumstances. "She said that everything in the universe follows patterns, and if you can see the patterns, you can find beauty anywhere." Emma leaned forward in her wheelchair, studying the spiral he'd created with red, blue, and yellow caps. "It does look like music would look if you could see sound instead of just hearing it, like a song made of colors." Tommy's face broke into the first genuine smile he'd worn since standing beside his grandmother's hospital bed, watching machines that couldn't save her anyway finally fall silent. "That's exactly what she used to say. You really understand." The man, Emma's father obviously, knelt down to Tommy's eye level with movements that suggested he was more comfortable in boardrooms than on park benches. "I'm Richard Walker, and this is my daughter Emma. What's your name, son?" "Thomas Martinez, sir, but everyone calls me Tommy." He straightened slightly, remembering his grandmother's lessons about dignity and manners being possessions that no one could take away from you, regardless of your circumstances. "Thank you for stopping to look at my work, Mr. Walker. Most people." He trailed off, unwilling to complete the sentence that might sound like self-pity. But Richard understood perfectly. "How long have you been on your own, Tommy?" Tommy's carefully constructed composure flickered slightly. The question was simultaneously too direct and too kind, cutting through his defenses in a way that made him want to retreat into the protective shell that had kept him safe on the streets. "I manage just fine by myself, sir." Emma, with the intuitive directness that only children possess, cut through his evasion with surgical precision. "You look really sad, though, and lonely. Are you hungry?" The simple questions hit Tommy harder than any social worker's interrogation or police officer's demand that he move along. His carefully constructed walls crumbled, and for a moment he wasn't a street-smart survivor, but simply a 7-year-old boy who missed his grandmother's bedtime stories, her Sunday morning pancakes, and the way she used to hum while folding laundry that smelled like sunshine and safety. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible above the street noise. "My abuela died 8 weeks ago, and the state said there wasn't anyone else. The foster homes were. They weren't good places for me." Emma reached out and touched his hand with her small fingers, and Tommy was amazed by how much comfort such a simple gesture could convey. "My mommy died when I was little too. Daddy says the hurt gets smaller over time, but it never completely goes away. But he also says that when we help other people who are hurting, it makes the pain easier to carry." In that moment, watching his daughter instinctively offer comfort to a homeless child while that child's eyes filled with grateful tears, Richard felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a chance encounter on a random afternoon. This was grace, presenting itself in the form of two children who recognized each other's pain and chose connection over self-protection. "Tommy," Richard said carefully, his voice carrying a weight of decision that surprised even him, "would you like to have lunch with us?" "As our guest, of course." Tommy looked between them, searching their faces for the catch, the condition, the moment when charity would transform into obligation or pity. But he saw only kindness and genuine interest, and a lonely little girl whose smile suggested she understood exactly what it felt like to be different from everyone else. "I'd like that very much, sir." The small family restaurant Richard chose was a world away from the exclusive establishments where he typically entertained business associates. Mismatched chairs surrounded tables covered with cheerful red-checkered cloths. The walls displayed photographs of 3 generations of the same family, and the comfortable chaos suggested a business run by people who treated every customer like a beloved relative visiting for Sunday dinner. Tommy sat carefully in his chair, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of a clean table, unlimited ice water, and a menu with prices that wouldn't require him to choose between eating today and eating tomorrow. He studied each option with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned that opportunities for real meals were precious gifts not to be wasted. "Order anything you want," Richard said, but Tommy continued his careful analysis of the menu, calculating not just what he wanted, but what would be appropriate to accept from these kind strangers. Emma, oblivious to Tommy's internal negotiations, chattered enthusiastically about the patterns she'd observed in his bottle cap art. "I bet you could create music that follows the same mathematical principles. Do you know how to play any instruments?" Tommy's hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept his most treasured possession carefully wrapped in a piece of soft cloth his grandmother had given him. "My abuela's friend Mr. Ramirez used to teach music at the community center. When she got too sick to work, he gave me something." He pulled out a worn harmonica, its chrome plating dulled by countless hours of practice and polished smooth by loving care. The instrument had clearly seen decades of use, but it gleamed with the kind of dignity that comes from being valued far beyond its monetary worth. He said music was the one language that everyone's heart understands, no matter what words they speak or where they come from. "Will you play something for us?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with anticipation and genuine interest, rather than the polite attention adults usually offered children's performances. Tommy glanced around the restaurant, suddenly conscious of the other diners, the potential for embarrassment if his playing wasn't good enough for such a nice place. "Here, with all these people listening?" "Music makes everything better," Emma said with the absolute certainty of someone who'd learned to find joy in small moments and unexpected connections. "Please, I promise we'll love it no matter what." Tommy brought the harmonica to his lips and began a melody his grandmother had hummed while preparing dinner, a simple tune that carried the bittersweet beauty of remembering love, even in the midst of profound loss. The melody was nothing complex or showy, just honest emotion transformed into notes that seemed to capture the feeling of sunset light filtering through kitchen windows and the safety of being truly known by someone who loved you unconditionally. The restaurant seemed to quiet around them. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The clatter of silverware stopped. Even the espresso machine's familiar hissing faded into background silence. When Tommy finished, the quiet stretched for a heartbeat before spontaneous applause erupted from nearby tables, accompanied by appreciative murmurs in both English and Spanish. Emma was absolutely glowing. That was magical. It made me feel like floating, but safe floating, like being held by music itself. Tommy's cheeks flushed with pride and something that might have been hope, an emotion he'd almost forgotten existed. Would you maybe like to learn how to play?" "More than anything in the whole world." Richard watched his daughter's transformation with growing amazement. In this humble restaurant, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a family business, listening to a homeless boy teach her the basics of breath control and embouchure, Emma was more vibrantly alive than she'd been during months of expensive therapy sessions in sterile medical facilities. As Tommy patiently showed Emma how to hold the harmonica properly, how to control her breathing from her diaphragm rather than her chest, how to shape her lips to create different tones and pitches, Richard noticed something subtle but profoundly significant. Emma was leaning forward in her wheelchair with an intensity he'd never witnessed, as if every fiber of her being was focused on connecting with the music and, by extension, with Tommy himself. "Mr. Walker," Tommy said during a quiet moment, while Emma practiced forming proper mouth positions, "I need to ask you something important. Why are you being so kind to me? I don't have anything valuable to offer in return." Richard considered the question seriously, recognizing its importance to this wise child who'd clearly learned that kindness often came with hidden costs. "Sometimes the universe places people in our path exactly when we need them most, Tommy. I have a feeling you and Emma found each other for reasons that go beyond coincidence." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. He quickly wiped away with the back of his hand. "I haven't had anyone to really talk to in so long. Emma makes me remember what it felt like to have family, to belong somewhere." As the afternoon wore on and the light outside the restaurant windows turned golden, Richard found himself making mental calculations that had nothing to do with stock portfolios or quarterly projections. Calculations about legal guardianship, social services navigation, and what it would actually take to ensure that Tommy Martinez never had to sleep on the streets again. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dr. Patricia Chen's Upper East Side office, illuminating walls lined with medical diplomas from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the Mayo Clinic. Credentials that testified to 3 decades of helping families navigate impossible situations. But Pat's expression as she listened to Richard's proposal suggested she thought her old friend might have finally ventured beyond the boundaries of rational thinking. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said, her voice carefully measured in the tone she reserved for delivering difficult truths to well-meaning parents. "You want to pursue legal guardianship of a homeless child you met 3 days ago because you believe he has some sort of therapeutic effect on Emma." Richard leaned forward in the leather chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Pat, I know exactly how it sounds. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I would have recommended psychological evaluation, but you should have seen them together. Emma was more present, more engaged, more genuinely alive than I've witnessed since Sarah's funeral." "Doctor." Chen sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of countless conversations with parents who'd exhausted medical options and turned to hope as a final treatment. "Richard, I've watched you move heaven and earth trying to help Emma walk. You've consulted with the finest specialists in the world, pursued experimental treatments that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, traveled to cutting-edge research facilities on 3 continents. But Emma's spina bifida isn't a psychological condition. It doesn't respond to friendship therapy or positive thinking." "I'm not talking about miracle cures," Richard insisted, his voice carrying an urgency that surprised them both. "I'm talking about giving Emma something she's never had, a genuine friendship with someone who sees past her wheelchair to who she actually is as a person." "And what about this boy, Tommy? Have you considered what happens when the initial excitement wears off? When the reality of caring for a traumatized child becomes more complicated than sharing meals and listening to harmonica music? Foster care exists because parenting damaged children requires specialized skills and infinite patience." Richard had spent the previous night staring at the ceiling, asking himself exactly these questions, while Emma slept more peacefully than she had in months, her new harmonica carefully placed on her bedside table, like a talisman against bad dreams. "I've spent 7 years trying to protect Emma from everything that might hurt her," he said quietly, "but maybe I've also protected her from everything that might actually heal her spirit." That afternoon, Richard and Emma returned to Marcus Garvey Park, both scanning the area hopefully for any sign of Tommy. Emma had been unusually animated all morning, frequently asking when they could visit her friend again, her disappointment obvious when Richard couldn't provide a definitive timeline. They found Tommy in his usual spot by the fountain, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a wrinkled business suit was kneeling beside him, her posture aggressive and her voice carrying the bureaucratic authority of someone accustomed to having her questions answered immediately. "You can't keep running from the placement system, Tommy. It's not safe or legal for a child your age to be living on the streets, regardless of your reasons for avoiding authorized shelters." "Please, ma'am," Tommy said quietly, his small hands clutching his harmonica like a lifeline against whatever fate this woman represented. "The group homes aren't safe places for kids like me. At least out here, nobody steals my things while I sleep or hurts me just because they can." Emma wheeled herself forward before Richard could intercept her, her voice carrying across the space with surprising authority. "Tommy, we came back to see you." The social worker looked up, immediately taking in Emma's obviously expensive wheelchair and Richard's hand-tailored clothing. Her demeanor shifted from bureaucratic intimidation to polite deference so quickly it would have been comical if the stakes hadn't been so serious. "Oh, I apologize, sir. I didn't realize this child was with you. I'm Jessica Rodriguez from Child Protective Services." "He's our friend," Emma announced with the fierce loyalty that had surprised Richard repeatedly over the past few days. "Tommy makes the most beautiful music in the world, and he's teaching me to play harmonica, and he knows how to find patterns in everything." After Ms. Rodriguez left with promises to reassess the situation and explore alternative placement options, Tommy looked at Richard and Emma with a complex mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. "This is my fault," Tommy said quietly, his voice heavy with the kind of guilt that children should never have to carry. "I shouldn't have let you be nice to me. Now you're involved in my problems, and CPS will probably make things harder for everyone." Emma reached out and took his hand with the kind of decisive gesture that brooked no argument. Friends are supposed to be involved in each other's problems. That's what makes them friends, instead of just people who happen to know each other's names. Looking at these two children, one privileged but isolated, the other homeless but wise beyond his years, Richard realized that Emma was absolutely right about the nature of friendship and responsibility. And in that moment of clarity, surrounded by the sounds of the city continuing its relentless rhythm around them, he knew exactly what he needed to do. 5 days later, after a legal marathon that had consumed more energy and resources than some of his major business acquisitions, Richard had achieved what social workers had assured him was virtually impossible. Tommy Martinez stood in the marble entryway of the Walker penthouse, officially designated as Richard's temporary ward, looking like Alice after tumbling down the rabbit hole into a wonderland that defied all logic and experience. The apartment occupied the entire 42nd floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential buildings. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park that real estate agents called priceless, museum-quality artwork lined the walls like a private gallery, and the living room alone was larger than most family homes in Middle America. Tommy clutched his plastic grocery bag of possessions, literally everything he owned in the world, and tried to process the enormity of what was happening to his life. "This is your room, son," Richard said, opening a door to reveal a space that could have comfortably housed an entire family. The bed was king-sized and covered with linens that probably cost more than Tommy's grandmother had spent on rent for her tiny apartment in 6 months. A desk sat near windows that overlooked the same park where they'd first met, and bookshelves waited to be filled with whatever stories might capture his imagination. Tommy set his meager belongings on the pristine comforter, the contrast so stark it was almost painful in its implications. 3 items: a change of clothes his grandmother had carefully mended, a photograph of her in a frame made from popsicle sticks they decorated together, and his harmonica wrapped in her favorite kitchen towel. "Mr. Walker," Tommy said, his voice carrying the weight of someone far older than his 7 years, "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Of course, Tommy. Always." "Why are you really doing this? People don't just take in street kids out of pure kindness. There's always something they want in return, always an angle. What's yours?" Before Richard could formulate an answer that might make sense to a child who'd learned to be suspicious of generosity, Emma wheeled in with the kind of radiant excitement that transformed her entire appearance from reserved to absolutely luminous. "Tommy! You're really here. You're really going to stay with us. Wait until you see everything. We have a library with over 1,000 books and a music room with a real grand piano that used to belong to a famous composer, and the kitchen has an ice cream maker, and there's a balcony where you can see the whole city." As Emma gave Tommy the complete tour, chattering enthusiastically about all the adventures they would have together, Richard followed at a distance, marveling at his daughter's complete transformation. The listless child, who'd moved through expensive therapy sessions with dutiful resignation, had been replaced by someone vibrant, purposeful, and genuinely happy. Emma saved the therapy room for last. "This is where I do my exercises every day," she explained, demonstrating her routine on the parallel bars with obvious pride in her hard-won strength. "My doctors say I have to keep my muscles as strong as possible, even if my legs don't work right. Sometimes I pretend I'm training to be a gymnast." Tommy watched with the intense focus he brought to everything that mattered, his dark eyes tracking each movement Emma made with scientific precision. Then, without explanation or preamble, he pulled out his harmonica and began to play. But this wasn't the simple melody from the park or the nostalgic tune from the restaurant. This was something entirely new, richer, more complex, a musical conversation that seemed to wrap around Emma like a warm embrace made of sound. As the notes filled the therapy room, resonating off the walls and windows, something extraordinary began to happen. Emma's legs, which had remained completely motionless for every moment of her 7 years on Earth, began to respond to the music. First, barely perceptible twitches in rhythm with Tommy's melody. Then more pronounced movement, as if her muscles were remembering something they'd never actually learned, responding to signals that medical science insisted could never reach them. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "Look at my legs. They're moving." Richard rushed closer, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever impossible spell Tommy's music had woven around them. Emma gripped the parallel bars with fierce determination and with visible concentration that seemed to engage her entire being, began to push, not just with her arms as she'd done thousands of times before, but with her legs as well. For 10 impossible, miraculous seconds, Richard counted every single one. Emma Walker stood fully upright, her feet bearing her own weight, her legs trembling with unprecedented effort, but unmistakably, undeniably functioning. Then her strength gave out, and she settled back into her wheelchair, breathing hard, but with tears of pure joy streaming down her face like liquid starlight. "I stood up, Daddy. I really, truly stood up. Did you see me? Did you see?" Richard was sobbing openly, unable to speak, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. Tommy had stopped playing and was staring at Emma with amazement, his harmonica still pressed to his lips as if he too was afraid that moving might break the magic of the moment. In 42 years of life, Richard had seen his company's stock price soar beyond all predictions, had closed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had been featured on magazine covers as one of America's most successful entrepreneurs under 45. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his experience, had prepared him for the earth-shattering miracle of watching his daughter stand for the first time in her life. As Tommy carefully tucked his harmonica away with trembling hands, as Emma continued to stare at her legs with newfound wonder and infinite possibility, Richard understood with absolute, unshakable certainty that this was only the beginning of something that would change all their lives in ways none of them could possibly imagine. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived at the Walker penthouse the next morning with a medical bag full of skepticism and 30 years of clinical experience that had taught her to distrust miraculous recoveries. She found Emma in the therapy room, practically vibrating with excitement, while Tommy sat quietly in the corner, his harmonica resting in his lap like a sacred artifact. "Show her, Tommy! Please show Dr. Chen what happened yesterday." Emma's voice carried a joy that Patricia had never heard in all their years of medical consultations and failed treatments. "Emma, sweetheart," Patricia said gently, settling into her professional demeanor, "I need you to understand that sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we want something very badly. What your father described to me on the phone sounds wonderful, but—" "It wasn't a trick," Emma interrupted, her small hands gripping her wheelchair with fierce determination. "I stood up, Dr. Chen. My legs actually worked." Patricia exchanged a meaningful glance with Richard, who stood by the window with an expression she'd never seen before, hope tempered by desperation to be believed. "Richard, you know I care about Emma more than almost anyone in the world. But spina bifida doesn't just reverse itself because a child plays music." Tommy looked up from his harmonica, his dark eyes meeting Patricia's with surprising directness. "Ma'am, I don't know anything about medicine, but I know music, and I know what I saw." Emma's legs moved with the melody, like they were remembering how to dance. There was something in the boy's quiet confidence that made Patricia pause. She'd seen countless charlatans and well-meaning amateurs promise miracle cures for Emma's condition. But Tommy wasn't promising anything. He was simply stating what he'd observed with the matter-of-fact honesty of childhood. "All right," Patricia said, settling into a chair with professional curiosity overriding her skepticism. "Let's see what we're talking about." Tommy brought the harmonica to his lips and began the same melody that had created yesterday's miracle. The notes seemed to fill the room with something more than sound, a presence, a warmth, a quality that made Patricia's medical training suddenly feel inadequate to explain what was happening. Emma gripped the parallel bars and closed her eyes, her face a study in concentrated effort. For several moments, nothing happened except the beautiful, haunting melody that seemed to speak directly to something deeper than hearing. Then, as the music reached its crescendo, Emma's legs began to respond. First the subtle twitching Patricia might have dismissed as muscle spasms, then deliberate coordinated movement that sent electric shocks of impossibility through her scientific worldview. Emma pushed with her legs, lifted herself with her arms, and for 15 seconds this time, 5 seconds longer than yesterday, she stood completely upright, tears streaming down her face as her body remembered what it had never been able to do before. When she settled back into her wheelchair, Patricia Chen sat in stunned silence, her medical bag forgotten, her 3 decades of education and experience suddenly feeling like inadequate preparation for what she'd just witnessed. "How?" she whispered, the word barely audible above the room's sudden quiet. Tommy carefully tucked his harmonica away. "My grandmother always said that healing comes in different forms, and sometimes the heart knows things that the mind can't understand." Maybe Emma's legs were just waiting for the right song to remember how strong they could be. Patricia looked at Richard, then at Emma's radiant face, then back at Tommy's serene expression. Everything she knew about medicine told her this was impossible, but everything she knew about love told her she was witnessing something that transcended the limitations of medical textbooks. "We need to document this," she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of scientific excitement and something that might have been reverence. "If Emma's condition is actually improving, we need to understand why." But even as she spoke, Patricia realized that some miracles might be meant to be experienced rather than explained. 2 weeks later, the Walker penthouse had transformed into something Richard had never imagined possible, a real home filled with the sounds of childhood friendship. Emma and Tommy had developed their own language of inside jokes, shared looks, and musical conversations that seemed to transcend the need for words. Every morning, they would meet in the music room, where Tommy continued Emma's harmonica lessons with the patience of a master teacher and the enthusiasm of a 7-year-old boy who'd finally found his purpose. Emma's progress was remarkable, not just musically, but physically. She was standing for longer periods each day, sometimes up to 30 seconds, and the strength in her legs seemed to be growing with each practice session. "Watch this, Daddy," Emma called out as Richard paused in the doorway during his morning routine. She gripped the parallel bars and, without waiting for Tommy's music, managed to lift herself partially upright, using a combination of arm strength and what appeared to be genuine leg function. "That's incredible, sweetheart," Richard said, but his amazement was tinged with growing concern. Word of Emma's improvement had somehow leaked beyond their small circle, and his assistant had fielded calls from medical researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers, all demanding access to what they were calling the miracle child. Tommy seemed to sense Richard's tension. "Mr. Walker, is everything okay? You look worried." Richard knelt down to the boy's eye level. "Tommy, what's happening with Emma is wonderful, but it's also attracted attention from people who might not have her best interests at heart. We may need to be very careful about who we let into our lives." The truth was more complicated than Richard wanted to admit. Dr. Chen had shared Emma's case with colleagues at Johns Hopkins, who had shared it with researchers at Stanford, who had somehow leaked it to a medical blogger with 500,000 followers. Now their private miracle was becoming public curiosity, and Richard felt his protective instincts going into overdrive. "I don't want to stop the music," Tommy said quietly, his small hand unconsciously moving to his harmonica, "but if it's causing problems for Emma—" "No!" Emma's voice was fierce, protective in a way that surprised all three of them. "Tommy's music isn't a problem. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm not going to let anyone take that away." That afternoon, as if to prove her point, Emma managed to stand for 45 seconds while Tommy played a complex piece he'd been composing specifically for her therapy sessions. But when she finally settled back into her wheelchair, she was trembling with exhaustion, and Richard noticed something that sent a chill through his chest. Emma's hands were shaking, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the week before. "Emma, how are you feeling?" he asked, trying to keep the concern out of his voice. "I'm fine, Daddy, just tired from working so hard." But her smile seemed forced, and when she thought no one was looking, Richard saw her wince as if something hurt. That night, after Emma and Tommy were asleep, Richard found himself standing at his daughter's bedroom door, watching her sleep fitfully, her small body occasionally jerking as if fighting something in her dreams. For the first time since this miraculous journey had begun, Richard wondered if progress always came with a price they might not be prepared to pay. The news van parked outside their building on a Tuesday morning was Richard's first indication that their private miracle had become public spectacle. By Wednesday, there were 3 vans. By Thursday, a small crowd of reporters, photographers, and curiosity seekers had transformed the normally sedate sidewalk into a media circus. "Mr. Walker, can you comment on reports that your daughter has been healed by a homeless boy's harmonica playing? Is it true that major medical centers are calling this impossible? What do you say to critics who claim this is an elaborate hoax?" Richard pushed through the crowd, his security team forming a protective barrier around Emma's wheelchair and Tommy's small form. The boy looked overwhelmed by the attention, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something that might have been fear. "I don't like this," Tommy whispered, as they made it safely into their building's lobby. "All these people asking questions, taking pictures. It doesn't feel right." Emma reached over and took his hand. "It's okay. Daddy will make it stop." But Richard wasn't sure he could. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across social media with hashtags like miracle music and healing harmonica. Medical experts were demanding to study both children. Religious leaders were claiming divine intervention, and skeptics were insisting the entire thing was an elaborate fraud designed to promote some upcoming book or documentary. Dr. Chen called that afternoon with news that made Richard's stomach drop. "Richard, I've been contacted by the Department of Health and Human Services. They want to investigate Tommy's living situation and Emma's medical claims. They're questioning whether a homeless child should be in your care and whether Emma's improvements are being exaggerated for financial gain." Financial gain. "Patricia, we haven't spoken to a single reporter or accepted any money from anyone." "I know that, but the officials don't. They're talking about mandatory evaluations for both children, possible removal of Tommy from your custody, and suspension of Emma's current treatment plan pending a full investigation." That evening, Richard sat both children down in the living room, trying to find words for an impossible conversation. "Emma, Tommy, I need to talk to you about what's been happening with all the reporters and attention." Emma's face immediately clouded with concern. "Are they going to take Tommy away?" Richard's hesitation was answer enough. Tommy straightened in his chair, his expression becoming the carefully neutral mask Richard had seen him wear when dealing with social workers and authority figures. "How long do I have?" Tommy asked quietly. "I don't know. My lawyers are working on it, but the government is getting involved and they have questions about Emma's improvement and your situation." Emma wheeled herself closer to Tommy, her small hand finding his. "They can't take you away. You're family now." But Tommy's expression suggested he'd heard promises like this before, and he understood better than Emma how quickly family could disappear when bureaucrats and officials decided what was best for everyone involved. "Maybe I should go," he said quietly, "before they make it worse for you and Emma." "No!" Emma's voice was fierce, desperate in a way that made Richard's chest tighten. "We'll figure this out. We'll make them understand that the music is real, that you belong here." Looking at these two children, one fighting to protect the boy who'd given her the gift of standing, the other preparing to sacrifice himself to save the people who'd given him a home, Richard realized that the greatest miracle wasn't Emma's ability to stand. It was the love these children had found in each other, and his growing understanding that he would fight anyone and everyone to protect it. The knock on their door came at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening, just as Emma and Tommy were finishing their dinner while practicing a complex duet Tommy had composed. Two social workers, a child psychologist, and a representative from the Department of Health and Human Services stood in their marble foyer with clipboards, official badges, and expressions that suggested this was not a friendly visit. "Mr. Walker, we need to speak with you about Thomas Martinez and the claims being made about your daughter's medical condition," said the lead official, a stern woman in her 50s whose name tag identified her as Director Susan Matthews. Richard's legal team had prepared him for this moment, but seeing Tommy's face go pale and Emma's hands grip her wheelchair's armrests made all the preparation feel inadequate. "Tommy," Director Matthews said, addressing the boy directly, "we've received some concerning information about your background that we need to discuss." Tommy stood very still, his harmonica clutched in his small hands like a talisman against whatever was coming. "According to our investigation, your real name is Thomas Gabriel Ramirez Martinez, and you're not actually an orphan. Your father, Gabriel Ramirez, is alive and has been looking for you since your grandmother's death." The words hit the room like a physical force. Emma gasped, Richard felt the blood drain from his face, and Tommy went completely rigid. "That's impossible," Richard said. "Tommy told us his grandmother said there was no one else." "Children sometimes hear what they need to hear to survive trauma," the psychologist explained gently. Tommy's father had been deployed overseas with the military when his mother, Tommy's grandmother, died suddenly. By the time he could arrange emergency leave and return to the States, Tommy had already run away from the temporary foster placement. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. My father is alive." Director Matthews nodded. "Staff Sergeant Gabriel Ramirez has been working with missing children organizations for months trying to find you. He's been stationed in Germany but has requested immediate transfer back to the United States." Emma wheeled herself closer to Tommy, her face filled with confusion and something that looked like terror. "But Tommy lives here now. This is his home." "Emma, sweetie," the psychologist said, "Tommy's father loves him very much and has been desperately worried. Families belong together whenever possible. Tommy seemed to be struggling with information that didn't fit the story he'd built around his survival. My abuela never talked about my father. She said he was gone forever. Sometimes grandparents try to protect children from complicated truths," Director Matthews explained. "Your father and your grandmother had disagreements about his military service, about how to raise you. She may have thought it was easier to let you believe he wasn't coming back." Richard watched Tommy's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. The boy who'd survived on the streets, who'd created beauty from bottle caps, who'd somehow unlocked Emma's ability to stand, was just a lost child whose father had been searching for him across continents. "What happens now?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer would change everything. "Tommy will be reunited with his father as soon as Staff Sergeant Ramirez can arrange transportation from Germany. It should be within the week." Emma's voice cut through the official discussion like a blade. "What about the music? What about helping me stand? What about our family?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a miracle about to be torn apart by bureaucracy and the complicated realities of a world where love didn't always triumph over logistics. Tommy looked at Emma, then at Richard, then at the harmonica in his hands. "I don't want to leave," he said quietly. "But if my father is really alive, if he's been looking for me..." For the first time since this impossible journey had begun, Richard realized that some miracles came with expiration dates, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was learning how to let go. Staff Sergeant Gabriel Ramirez arrived from Germany on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like the end of the world. He was a tall man with kind eyes that were unmistakably Tommy's, wearing his military uniform with the bearing of someone who'd spent years protecting others. When he saw his son for the first time in 8 months, he dropped to his knees right there in the Walker's foyer and wept openly. "Mijo," he said, his voice breaking as he pulled Tommy into his arms. "I've been looking everywhere for you. I never stopped searching." Tommy stood very still in his father's embrace, overwhelmed by emotions too complex for a 7-year-old to process. Joy at discovering his father was alive, confusion about why his grandmother had never mentioned it, and devastating sadness at the thought of leaving Emma and Richard. Emma watched the reunion from her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face. "Tommy's daddy seems really nice," she whispered to Richard, her voice carrying the forced brightness of someone trying to be happy about something that was breaking her heart. Over the next 3 days, Gabriel stayed in a hotel near the penthouse, spending every possible moment with Tommy while trying to understand the extraordinary circumstances that had brought his son into the Walker family's life. He listened with growing amazement as Richard explained about Emma's condition, Tommy's music, and the miraculous progress she'd made. "In all my years in the service, I've seen a lot of things that couldn't be easily explained," Gabriel said during one of their long conversations. "But what you're describing, what Tommy has helped Emma achieve, it's beyond anything I could have imagined." He was a good man, Richard realized, with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. A loving father who'd been trapped by circumstances beyond his control, who'd spent months moving heaven and earth trying to find his missing child. Under any other circumstances, Richard would have been thrilled to see a family reunited. But watching Tommy practice with Emma for what might be the last time, seeing her struggle to stand for even 20 seconds without his music to guide her, Richard felt something breaking in his chest that had nothing to do with his own loss and everything to do with his daughter's future. "Daddy," Emma said that evening as Richard tucked her into bed, "when Tommy leaves with his father, will I stop being able to stand?" Richard had been dreading this question. "I don't know, sweetheart. But even if the standing becomes harder, what Tommy gave you was more than just the ability to use your legs for a few seconds. He gave you confidence and music and the knowledge that miracles are possible. But I don't want a different miracle," Emma said quietly. "I want this one. I want Tommy to stay." Gabriel knocked on Richard's study door late that night, his expression troubled. "Mr. Walker, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "If I take Tommy back to Colorado Springs where I'm being stationed, will Emma lose her ability to stand?" Richard considered lying, considered softening the truth to make Gabriel's decision easier, but the man deserved honesty. "I think there's a very good chance that without Tommy's music, Emma's progress will stop, maybe even reverse." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. "And if I leave him here with you, I lose my son." "I don't want to take your son from you, Gabriel. I want what's best for both these children." "So do I," Gabriel said quietly. "But I'm not sure what that is anymore." The next morning, Tommy made a request that surprised everyone. He wanted to spend one more day in Marcus Garvey Park, where everything had begun, before making any final decisions about his future. As they sat by the fountain, where bottle caps had first created patterns that looked like music, Tommy pulled out his harmonica and played the melody that had started Emma's healing journey. "Whatever happens," he said, when the last note faded away, "I want you to know that finding you and Emma saved me too. I was so lost after Abuela died, and you gave me a family when I thought families were just something other people got to have." Emma reached over and took his hand. "You'll always be my family, Tommy, no matter where you go." Richard looked at these two children who'd found each other across impossible circumstances, who'd created something beautiful from their shared pain, and realized that the next 24 hours would determine not just their future, but the future of miracles themselves. Tomorrow, they would have to choose between love and law, between miracles and reality, between the family they'd created and the family Tommy had been born into, and Richard had no idea how to make that choice for children who deserved so much more than the complicated world was prepared to give them. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Walker penthouse as three families, biological, chosen, and about to be redefined, gathered in the living room for a conversation that would determine everyone's future. Gabriel Ramirez sat across from Richard, while Tommy and Emma huddled together on the couch, their hands intertwined like lifelines in a storm. "I've been thinking all night," Gabriel began, his military bearing softened by obvious emotional struggle. "About duty, about love, about what it means to be a father." Tommy looked at his biological father with eyes that held too much wisdom for someone so young. "Papa, I remember you now. You used to sing lullabies in Spanish and make pancakes shaped like airplanes before you left for deployment." Gabriel's voice cracked. "You were only 6 years old, mijo," your abuela thought. "She thought it would be easier if you forgot me while I was overseas. She was angry about my deployment, said the military was stealing me from our family." "She never said you were dead," Tommy said quietly. "She just said you were gone, to where the music stops. I thought that meant heaven." Emma squeezed Tommy's hand tighter. "But you found each other again. That's a miracle too." Gabriel nodded, then looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Walker, I need to ask you something that goes against every instinct I have as a father. Would you be willing to adopt Tommy legally, while allowing me to remain an active part of his life?" The words hung in the air like a prayer, waiting for an answer. Richard's eyes widened. "Gabriel, are you sure? He's your son." "Yes, he's my son," Gabriel said, tears flowing freely down his weathered face. "But he's also something more now. He's part of something miraculous that I can't take him away from. The military is reassigning me to Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. I'll be 20 minutes away instead of thousands of miles. I can visit regularly, take him on weekends, be his father without destroying the family he's found here." Tommy looked between the two men who both loved him, his small face processing possibilities he'd never dared imagine. "You mean I could have 2 families, 2 daddies who love me?" "If that's what you want, son," Gabriel said softly. "I spent 8 months learning that love isn't about possession. It's about doing what's best for the people you care about, even when it breaks your heart." Emma wheeled herself closer to both Tommy and Gabriel. "Mr. Gabriel, would you like to hear Tommy play? His music is magical." Gabriel nodded, and Tommy pulled out his harmonica with trembling hands. But instead of his usual melody, he began to play something new, a song that somehow captured both the joy of reunion and the bittersweet beauty of expanded love, notes that spoke of families that grow beyond biology into something larger than the sum of their parts. As the music filled the room, Emma gripped her wheelchair's armrests and began to rise. But this time, something different happened. Instead of the careful, concentrated effort that had marked her previous attempts, she stood with fluid grace, her legs strong and steady, her balance perfect. And then, as Tommy's melody reached its crescendo, Emma took her first step, then another, and another. Gabriel gasped. Richard began to cry, and Tommy continued playing as Emma walked across the room to where her birth father and chosen father sat in stunned amazement. "The miracle was never just about standing," Emma said, her voice filled with wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 7 years. "It was about learning that love multiplies when you share it instead of hoarding it." Dr. Patricia Chen, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Emma, medically speaking, what just happened should be impossible. But then again, so should the family that's been created in this room." Gabriel stood and extended his hand to Richard. "Partners in raising an extraordinary boy." Richard shook his hand firmly. "Partners. And Gabriel, thank you for showing me what real fatherhood looks like." Tommy ran to both men, wrapping his arms around them both. "I have 2 dads, Emma can walk, and nobody has to choose between families anymore." 6 months later, the Walker Ramirez household had found its rhythm. Gabriel visited 3 times a week and took Tommy for weekends filled with military base adventures and stories of their family's history. Richard provided daily stability, educational opportunities, and the kind of quiet love that helped heal old wounds. Emma not only walked but had begun dancing, her movements graceful and strong, as she accompanied Tommy's increasingly complex musical compositions. The media attention had faded, leaving behind only the essential truth. Sometimes miracles aren't about defying natural law. They're about discovering that love has its own laws that transcend every limitation humanity tries to impose. On quiet evenings, when Gabriel would visit for dinner and stay to help with bedtime stories, when Emma and Tommy would practice their musical duets while Richard worked nearby, when three adults who'd learned to parent together would tuck two children who'd learned to heal each other into beds in rooms that had become home for everyone involved. The real miracle became clear. It wasn't that a homeless boy's harmonica had made a paralyzed girl walk. It was that broken hearts had found a way to love so fiercely, so completely, and so selflessly that they'd rewritten the rules about what families could look like and what healing actually meant. Tommy's bottle cap patterns still decorated the penthouse, now preserved under glass as art installations that reminded everyone that beauty could be found in the most unlikely places. Emma's first wheelchair sat in the corner of the music room, not as a symbol of limitation, but as a monument to the journey that had brought them all together. And sometimes, when the evening light hit the windows just right, when the city's sounds created their own symphony below, when love had multiplied into something large enough to hold everyone who needed it, you could hear the echo of a harmonica playing a melody that sounded like hope itself, a song that promised that miracles weren't about getting everything you thought you wanted, but about discovering that what you actually needed had been there all along, waiting for the right moment, the right people, and the right music to bring it to life. In the end, they learned that some families are born, some are chosen, and the very best ones are both.